I must have used that kind of money myself, a little, before everything went on the CompuBank. I guess that's how they were able to do it, in the way they did, all at once, without anyone knowing beforehand. If there had still been portable money, it would have been more difficult. It was after the catastrophe, when they shot the president and machine-gunned the Congress, and the army declared a state of emergency. They blamed it on the Islamic fanatics at the time. "Keep calm," they said on television. "Everything is under control." I was stunned. Everyone was, I know that. It was hard to believe. The entire government, gone, like that. How did they get in? How did it happen? That was when they suspended the Constitution. They said it would be temporary. There wasn't even any rioting in the streets. People stayed home at night, watching television, looking for some direction. There wasn't even an enemy you could put your finger on. "Look out," said Moira to me over the phone. "Here it comes." "Here what comes?" I said. "You wait," she said. "They've been building up to this. It's you and me up against the wall, baby." She was quoting an expression of my mother's, but she wasn't intending to be funny. Things continued in that state of suspended animation for weeks, although some things did happen. Newspapers were censored, and some were closed down, for security reasons, they said. The roadblocks began to appear, and identipasses. Everyone approved of that, since it was obvious you couldn't be too careful. They said that new elections would be held, but that it would take some time to prepare for them. The thing to do, they said, was to continue on as usual. The porno marts were shut, though, and there were no longer any Feels on Wheels vans and bundle buggies circling the square. But I wasn't sad to see them go. We all knew what a nuisance they'd been. "It's high time somebody did something," said the woman behind the counter, at the store where I usually bought my cigarettes. It was on the corner, a newsstand chain, papers, candy, cigarettes. The woman was older, with gray hair, my mother's generation. "Did they just close them, or what?" I asked. She shrugged. "Who knows, who cares," she said. "Maybe they just moved them off somewhere else. Trying to get rid of it altogether is like trying to stamp out mice, you know?" She punched my compu number into the till, barely looking at it. I was a regular by then. "People were complaining," she said. The next morning, on my way to the library for the day, I stopped by the same store for another pack because I'd run out. I was smoking more those days. It was the tension. You could feel it, like a subterranean hum. Although things seemed so quiet. I was drinking more coffee, too, and having trouble sleeping. Everyone was a little jumpy. There was a lot more music on the radio than usual, and fewer words. It was after we'd been married, for years it seemed. She was 3 or 4, in daycare. We'd all got up in the usual way and had breakfast, granola, I remember, and Luke had driven her off to school in the little outfit I'd bought her just a couple of weeks before, striped overalls and a blue t-shirt. What month was this? It must have been September. There was a school pool that was supposed to pick them up, but for some reason I'd wanted Luke to do it. I was getting worried even about the school pool. No children walked to school anymore. There had been too many disappearances. When I got to the corner store, the usual woman wasn't there. Instead, there was a man, a young man. He couldn't have been more than 20. "She sick?" I said as I handed him my card. "Who?" he said, aggressively, I thought. "The woman who's usually here," I said. "How would I know?" he said. He was punching my number in, studying each number, punching with one finger. He obviously hadn't done it before. I drummed my fingers on the counter, impatient for a cigarette, wondering if anyone had ever told him something could be done about those pimples on his neck. I remember quite clearly what he looked like. Tall, slightly stooped, dark hair cut short, brown eyes that seemed to focus 2 inches behind the bridge of my nose, and that acne. I suppose I remember him so clearly because of what he said next. "Sorry," he said. "This number's not valid." "That's ridiculous," I said. "It must be. I've got thousands in my account. I just got the statement 2 days ago. Try it again." "It's not valid," he repeated obstinately. "See that red light? Means it's not valid." "You must have made a mistake," I said. "Try it again." He shrugged and gave me a fed-up smile, but he did try the number again. This time I watched his fingers on each number and checked the numbers that came up in the window. It was my number, all right, but there was the red light again. "See," he said again, still with that smile, as if he knew some private joke he wasn't going to tell me. "I'll phone them from the office," I said. The system had fouled up before, but a few phone calls usually straightened it out. Still, I was angry, as if I'd been unjustly accused of something I didn't even know about, as if I'd made the mistake myself. "You do that," he said indifferently. I left the cigarettes on the counter, since I hadn't paid for them. I figured I could borrow some at work. I did phone from the office, but all I got was a recording. The lines were overloaded, the recording said. Could I please phone back? The lines stayed overloaded all morning, as far as I could tell. I phoned back several times, but no luck. Even that wasn't too unusual. About 2:00 after lunch, the director came into the disking room. "I have something to tell you," he said. He looked terrible. His hair was untidy, his eyes were pink and wobbling, as though he'd been drinking. We all looked up, turned off our machines. There must have been 8 or 10 of us in the room. "I'm sorry," he said, "but it's the law. I really am sorry." "For what?" somebody said. "I have to let you go," he said. "It's the law. I have to. I have to let you all go." He said this almost gently, as if we were wild animals, frogs he'd caught in a jar, as if he were being humane. "We're being fired?" I said. I stood up. "But why?" "Not fired," he said. "Let go. You can't work here anymore. It's the law." He ran his hands through his hair, and I thought, he's gone crazy. The strain has been too much for him, and he's blown his wiring. "You can't just do that," said the woman who sat next to me. This sounded false, improbable, like something you would say on television. "It isn't me," he said. "You don't understand. Please go, now." His voice was rising. "I don't want any trouble. If there's trouble, the books might be lost, things will get broken." He looked over his shoulder. "They're outside," he said, "in my office. If you don't go now, they'll come in themselves. They gave me 10 minutes. By now he sounded crazier than ever. "He's loopy," someone said out loud, which we must all have thought. But I could see out into the corridor, and there were 2 men standing there in uniforms, with machine guns. This was too theatrical to be true. Yet there they were. Sudden apparitions, like Martians. There was a dreamlike quality to them. They were too vivid, too at odds with their surroundings. "Just leave the machines," he said while we were getting our things together, filing out, as if we could have taken them. We stood in a cluster on the steps outside the library. We didn't know what to say to one another. Since none of us understood what had happened, there was nothing much we could say. We looked at one another's faces and saw dismay and a certain shame, as if we'd been caught doing something we shouldn't. "It's outrageous," one woman said, but without belief. What was it about this that made us feel we deserved it? When I got back to the house, nobody was there. Luke was still at work, my daughter was at school. I felt tired, bone tired, but when I sat down, I got up again. I couldn't seem to sit still. I wandered through the house, from room to room. I remember touching things, not even that consciously, just placing my fingers on them. Things like the toaster, the sugar bowl, the ashtray in the living room. After a while, I picked up the cat and carried her around with me. I wanted Luke to come home. I thought I should do something, take steps, but I didn't know what steps I could take. I tried phoning the bank again, but I only got the same recording. I poured myself a glass of milk. I told myself I was too jittery for another coffee. I went into the living room and sat down on the sofa and put the glass of milk on the coffee table, carefully, without drinking any of it. I held the cat up against my chest so I could feel her purring against my throat. After a while, I phoned my mother at her apartment, but there was no answer. She'd settled down more by then. She'd stopped moving every few years. She lived across the river in Boston. I waited a while and phoned Moira. She wasn't there either. But when I tried half an hour later, she was. In between those phone calls, I just sat on the sofa. What I thought about was my daughter's school lunches. I thought maybe I'd been giving her too many peanut butter sandwiches. "I've been fired," I told Moira when I got her on the phone. She said she would come over. By that time, she was working for a women's collective, the publishing division. They put out books on birth control and rape and things like that, though there wasn't as much demand for those things as there used to be. "I'll come over," she said. She must have been able to tell from my voice that this was what I wanted. She got there after some time. "So," she said. She threw off her jacket, sprawled into the oversized chair. "Tell me. First we'll have a drink." She got up and went to the kitchen and poured us a couple of scotches, and came back and sat down, and I tried to tell her what had happened to me. When I'd finished, she said, "Tried getting anything on your CompuCard today?" "Yes," I said. I told her about that too. "They've frozen them," she said. "Mine too. The collectives too. Any account with an F on it instead of an M. All they needed to do is push a few buttons. We're cut off." "But I've got over $2,000 in the bank," I said, as if my own account was the only one that mattered. "Women can't hold property anymore," she said. "It's a new law. Turned on the TV today?" "No," I said. "It's on there," she said. "All over the place." She was not stunned the way I was. In some strange way, she was gleeful, as if this was what she'd been expecting for some time, and now she'd been proven right. She even looked more energetic, more determined. "Luke can use your CompuCount for you," she said. "They'll transfer your number to him, or that's what they say, husband or male next of kin." "But what about you?" I said. She didn't have anyone. "I'll go underground," she said. "Some of the gays can take over our numbers and buy us things we need." "But why?" I said. "Why did they?" "Ours is not to reason why," said Moira. "They had to do it that way, the CompuCounts and the jobs both at once. Can you picture the airports otherwise? They don't want us going anywhere, you can bet on that." I went to pick my daughter up from school. I drove with exaggerated care. By the time Luke got home, I was sitting at the kitchen table. She was drawing with felt pens at her own little table in the corner, where her paintings were taped up next to the refrigerator. Luke knelt beside me and put his arms around me. "I heard," he said, on the car radio driving home. "Don't worry, I'm sure it's temporary." "Did they say why?" I said. He didn't answer that. "We'll get through it," he said, hugging me. "You don't know what it's like," I said. "I feel as if somebody cut off my feet." I wasn't crying. Also, I couldn't put my arms around him. "It's only a job," he said, trying to soothe me. "I guess you get all my money," I said. "And I'm not even dead." I was trying for a joke, but it came out sounding macabre. "Hush," he said. He was still kneeling on the floor. "You know I'll always take care of you." I thought, already he's starting to patronize me. Then I thought, already you're starting to get paranoid. "I know," I said. "I love you." Later, after she was in bed and we were having supper, and I wasn't feeling so shaky, I told him about the afternoon. I described the director coming in, blurting out his announcement. "It would have been funny if it wasn't so awful," I said. I thought he was drunk. Maybe he was, The army was there and everything. Then I remembered something I'd seen and hadn't noticed at the time. It wasn't the army. It was some other army. There were marches, of course, a lot of women and some men, but they were smaller than you might have thought. I guess people were scared. And when it was known that the police or the army or whoever they were would open fire almost as soon as any of the marches even started, the marches stopped. A few things were blown up, post offices, subway stations, but you couldn't even be sure who was doing it. It could have been the army to justify the computer searches, and the other ones, the door-to-doors. I didn't go on any of the marches. Luke said it would be futile, and I had to think about them, my family, him and her. I did think about my family. I started doing more housework, more baking. I tried not to cry at mealtimes. By this time, I'd started to cry without warning, and to sit beside the bedroom window, staring out. I didn't know many of the neighbors, and when we met, outside on the street, we were careful to exchange nothing more than the ordinary greetings. Nobody wanted to be reported for disloyalty. Remembering this, I remember also my mother, years before. I must have been 14, 15, that age when daughters are most embarrassed by their mothers. I remember her coming back to one of our many apartments with a group of other women, part of her ever-changing circle of friends. They'd been in a march that day. It was during the time of the porn riots, or was it the abortion riots? They were close together. There were a lot of bombings then. Clinics, video stores. It was hard to keep track. My mother had a bruise on her face, and a little blood. You can't stick your hand through a glass window without getting cut, is what she said about it. Fucking pigs. Fucking bleeders, one of her friends said. They called the other side bleeders, after the signs they carried. Let them bleed. So it must have been the abortion riots. I went into my bedroom to be out of their way. They were talking too much and too loudly. They ignored me and I resented them. My mother and her rowdy friends. I didn't see why she had to dress that way, in overalls, as if she were young, or to swear so much. You're such a prude, she would say to me, in a tone of voice that was on the whole pleased. She liked being more outrageous than I was, more rebellious. Adolescents are always such prudes. Part of my disapproval was that, I'm sure, perfunctory, routine. But also I wanted from her a life more ceremonious, less subject to makeshift and decampment. You were a wanted child, God knows, she would say at other moments, lingering over the photo albums in which she had me framed. These albums were thick with babies, but my replicas thinned out as I grew older, as if the population of my duplicates had been hit by some plague. She would say this a little regretfully, as though I hadn't turned out entirely as she had expected. No mother is ever completely a child's idea of what a mother should be, and I suppose it works the other way around as well. But despite everything, we didn't do badly by one another. We did as well as most. I wish she were here, so I could tell her I finally know this. Someone has come out of the house. I hear the distant. What will Evoran give birth to? A baby, as we all hope? Or something else? An unbaby, with a pinhead or a snout like a dog's, or two bodies. Or a hole in its heart, or no arms, or webbed hands and feet. There's no telling. They could tell once with machines, but that is now outlawed. What would be the point of knowing anyway? You can't have them taken out. Whatever it is, must be carried to term. The chances are 1 in 4. We learned that at the center. The air got too full once of chemicals, rays, radiation. The water swarmed with toxic molecules. All of that takes years to clean up. And meanwhile, they creep into your body, camp out in your fatty cells. Who knows? Your very flesh may be polluted, dirty as an oily beach, sure death to shorebirds and unborn babies. Maybe a vulture would die of eating you. Maybe you light up in the dark, like an old-fashioned watch. Death watch. That's a kind of beetle. It buries carrion. I can't think of myself, my body, sometimes without seeing the skeleton. How I must appear to an electron. A cradle of life made of bones. And within, hazards, warped proteins, bad crystals jagged as glass. Women took medicines, pills. Men sprayed trees. Cows ate grass. All that souped-up piss flowed into the rivers. Not to mention the exploding atomic power plants along the San Andreas Fault. Nobody's fault during the earthquakes. And the mutant strain of syphilis no mold could touch. Some did it themselves. Had themselves tied shut with catgut or scarred with chemicals. How could they, said Aunt Lydia. Oh, how could they have done such a thing? Jezebels, scorning God's gifts. Wringing her hands. It's a risk you're taking, said Aunt Lydia. But you are the shock troops. You will march out and advance into dangerous territory. The greater the risk, the greater the glory. She clasped her hands, radiant with our phony courage. We looked down at the tops of our desks. To go through all that and give birth to a shredder, it wasn't a fine thought. We didn't know exactly what would happen to the babies that didn't get past, that were declared unbabies. But we knew they were put somewhere, quickly, away. There was no one cause, says Aunt Lydia. She stands at the front of the room in her khaki dress, a pointer in her hand. Pulled down in front of the blackboard, where once there would have been a map, is a graph, showing the birth rate per 1,000, for years and years. A slippery slope, down past the 0 line of replacement, and down, and down. Of course, some women believed there would be no future. They thought the world would explode. That was the excuse they used, says Aunt Lydia. They said there was no sense in breeding. Aunt Lydia's nostrils narrow. Such wickedness. They were lazy women, she says. They were sluts. On the top of my desk there are initials, carved into the wood, and dates. The initials are sometimes in 2 sets, joined by the word loves. J.H. loves B.P., 1954. O.R. loves L.T. These seem to me like the inscriptions I used to read about, carved on the stone walls of caves, or drawn with a mixture of soot and animal fat. They seem to me incredibly ancient. The desktop is of blonde wood, it slants down, and there is an armrest on the right side to lean on when you were writing on paper with a pen. Inside the desk you could keep things, books, notebooks. These habits of former times appear to me now lavish, decadent almost, immoral, like the orgies of barbarian regimes. M. loves G, 1972. This carving, done with a pencil dug many times into the worn varnish of the desk, has the pathos of all vanished civilizations. It's like a handprint on stone. Whoever made that was once alive. There are no dates after the mid-'80s. This must have been one of the schools that was closed down then, for lack of children. They made mistakes, says Aunt Lydia. We don't intend to repeat them. Her voice is pious, condescending, the voice of those whose duty it is to tell us unpleasant things for our own good. I would like to strangle her. I shove this thought away almost as soon as I think it. A thing is valued, she says, only if it is rare and hard to get. We want you to be valued, girls. She is rich in pauses, which she savors in her mouth. Think of yourselves as pearls. We, sitting in our rows, eyes down. We make her salivate morally. We are hers to define. We must suffer her adjectives. I think about pearls. Pearls are congealed oyster spit. This is what I will tell Moira, later if I can. This is what she says, whispers, more or less. I can't remember exactly, because I had no way of writing it down. I filled it out for her as much as I can. We didn't have much time, so she just gave the outlines. Also, she told me this in 2 sessions. We managed a second break together. I've tried to make it sound as much like her as I can. It's a way of keeping her alive. I left that old hag, Aunt Elisabeth, tied up like a Christmas turkey behind the furnace. I wanted to kill her. I really felt like it. But now I'm just as glad I didn't, or things would be a lot worse for me. I couldn't believe how easy it was to get out of the center. In that brown outfit, I just walked right through. I kept on going as if I knew where I was heading, till I was out of sight. I didn't have any great plan. It wasn't an organized thing like they thought. Though when they were trying to get it out of me, I made up a lot of stuff. You do that, when they use the electrodes and the other things. You don't care what you say. I kept my shoulders back and chin up and marched along, trying to think of what to do next. When they busted the press, they'd picked up a lot of the women I knew, and I thought they'd most likely have the rest by now. I was sure they had a list. We were dumb to think we could keep it going the way we did, even underground, even when we'd moved everything out of the office and into people's cellars and back rooms. So I knew better than to try any of those houses. I had some sort of an idea of where I was in relation to the city, though I was walking along a street I couldn't remember having seen before. But I figured out from the sun where north was. Girl Scouts was some use after all. I thought I might as well head that way, see if I could find the yard or the square or anything around it. Then I would know for sure where I was. Also, I thought it would look better for me to be going in towards the center of things rather than away. It would look more plausible. They'd set up more checkpoints while we were inside the center. They were all over the place. The first one scared the shit out of me. I came on it suddenly around a corner. I knew it wouldn't look right if I turned around in full view and went back, so I bluffed it through, the same as I had at the gate, putting on that frown and keeping myself stiff and pursing my lips and looking right through them, as if they were festering sores. You know the way the ants look when they say the word man. It worked like a charm. And it did at the other checkpoints, too. But the insides of my head were going around like crazy. I only had so much time before they found the old bat and sent out the alarm. Soon enough, they'd be looking for me. One fake ant, on foot. I tried to think of someone. I ran over and over the people I knew. At last, I tried to remember what I could about our mailing list. We destroyed it, of course, early on. Or we didn't destroy it, we divided it up among us, and each one of us memorized a section, and then we destroyed it. We were still using the mails then, but we didn't put our logo on the envelopes anymore. It was getting far too risky. So I tried to recall my section of the list. I won't tell you the name I chose, because I don't want them to get in trouble, if they haven't already. It could be I've spilled all this stuff. It's hard to remember what you say when they're doing it. You'll say anything. I chose them because they were a married couple, and those were safer than anyone single, and especially anyone gay. Also, I remembered the designation beside their name. Q, it said, which meant Quaker. We had the religious denominations marked where there were any, for marches. That way you could tell who might turn out to what. It was no good calling on the C's to do abortion stuff, for instance. Not that we'd done much of that lately. I remembered their address, too. We'd grilled each other on those addresses. It was important to remember them exactly, zip code and all. By this time I had hit Mass Avenue and I knew where I was. And I knew where they were, too. Now I was worrying about something else. When these people saw an ant coming up the walk, wouldn't they just lock the door and pretend not to be home? But I had to try it anyway. It was my only chance. I figured they weren't likely to shoot me. It was about 5 o'clock by this time. I was tired of walking, especially that ant sway like a goddamn soldier, poke her up the ass. And I hadn't had anything to eat since breakfast. What I didn't know, of course, was that in those early days the ants, and even the center, were hardly common knowledge. It was all secret at first, behind barbed wire. There might have been objections to what they were doing, even then. So although people had seen the odd ant around, they weren't really aware of what they were for. They must have thought they were some kind of army nurse. Already they'd stopped asking questions, unless they'd had to. So these people let me in right away. It was the woman who came to the door. I told her I was doing a questionnaire. I did that so she wouldn't look surprised, in case anyone was watching. But as soon as I was inside the door, I took off the headgear and told them who I was. They could have phoned the police or whatever. I know I was taking a chance. But like I say, there wasn't any choice. Anyway, they didn't. They gave me some clothes, a dress of hers, and burned the aunt's outfit and the pass in their furnace. They knew that had to be done right away. They didn't like having me there. That much was clear. It made them very nervous. They had 2 little kids, both under 7. I could see their point. I went to the can. What a relief that was. Bathtub full of plastic fish and so on. Then I sat upstairs in the kids' room and played with them and their plastic blocks while their parents stayed downstairs and decided what to do about me. I didn't feel scared by then. In fact, I felt quite good. Fatalistic, you could say. Then the woman made me a sandwich and a cup of coffee, and the man said he'd take me to another house. They hadn't risked phoning. The other house was Quakers too, and they were pay dirt, because they were a station on the underground female road. After the first man left, they said they'd try to get me out of the country. I won't tell you how, because some of the stations may still be operating. Each one of them was in contact with only one other one, always the next one along. There were advantages to that. It was better if you were caught. But disadvantages too. Because if one station got busted, the entire chain backed up until they could make contact with one of their couriers, who could set up an alternate route. They were better organized than you'd think, though. They'd infiltrated a couple of useful places. One of them was the post office. They had a driver there with one of those handy little trucks. I made it over the bridge and into the city proper in a mail sack. I can tell you that now because they got him soon after that. He ended up on the wall. You hear about these things. You hear a lot in here. You'd be surprised. The commanders tell us themselves. I guess they figure why not. There's no one we can pass it on to except each other, and that doesn't count. I'm making this sound easy, but it wasn't. I nearly shat bricks the whole time. One of the hardest things was knowing that these other people were risking their lives for you when they didn't have to. But they said they were doing it for religious reasons, and I shouldn't take it personally. That helped some. They had silent prayers every evening. I found that hard to get used to at first, because it reminded me too much of that shit at the center. It made me feel sick to my stomach, to tell you the truth. I had to make an effort, tell myself that this was a whole other thing. I hated it at first, but I figure it was what kept them going. They knew more or less what would happen to them if they got caught. Not in detail, but they knew. By that time, they'd started putting some of it on the TV, the trials and so forth. It was before the sectarian roundups began in earnest. As long as you said you were some sort of a Christian and you were married, for the first time that is, they were still leaving you pretty much alone. They were concentrating first on the others. They got them more or less under control before they started in on everybody else. I was underground, it must have been 8 or 9 months. I was taken from one safe house to another. There were more of those then. They weren't all Quakers. Some of them weren't even religious. They were just people who didn't like the way things were going. I almost made it out. They got me up as far as Salem. Then in a truck full of chickens into Maine. I almost puked from the smell. You ever thought what it would be like to be shat on by a truckload of chickens? All of them carsick? They were planning to get me across the border there, not by car or truck, that was already too difficult, but by boat, up the coast. I didn't know that until the actual night. They never told you the next step until right before it was happening. They were careful that way. So I don't know what happened. Maybe somebody got cold feet about it, or somebody outside got suspicious. Or maybe it was the boat. Maybe they thought the guy was out in his boat at night too much. By that time, it must have been crawling with eyes up there, and everywhere else close to the border. Whatever it was. They picked us up just as we were coming out the back door to go down to the dock. Me and the guy, and his wife too. They were an older couple, in their 50s. He'd been in the lobster business, back before all that happened to the shore fishing there. I don't know what became of them after that, because they took me in a separate van. I thought it might be the end for me, or back to the center and the attentions of Aunt Lydia and her steel cable. She enjoyed that, you know. She pretended to do all that love the sinner, hate the sin stuff, but she enjoyed it. I did consider offing myself, and maybe I would have if there'd been any way. But they had 2 of them in the back of the van with me, watching me like a hawk. Didn't say a hell of a lot, just sat and watched me in that wall-eyed way they have. So it was no go. We didn't end up at the center, though. We went somewhere else. I won't go into what happened after that. I'd rather not talk about it. All I can say is they didn't leave any marks. When that was over, they showed me a movie. Know what it was about? It was about life in the colonies. In the colonies, they spend their time cleaning up. They're very clean-minded these days. Sometimes it's just bodies after a battle. The ones in city ghettos are the worst. They're left around longer. They get rottener. This bunch doesn't like dead bodies lying around. They're afraid of a plague or something. So the women in the colonies there do the burning. The other colonies are worse, though. The toxic dumps and the radiation spills. They figure you've got 3 years maximum at those, before your nose falls off and your skin pulls away like rubber gloves. They don't bother to feed you much, or give you protective clothing or anything. It's cheaper not to. Anyway, they're mostly people they want to get rid of. They say there's other colonies, not so bad, where they do agriculture, cotton and tomatoes and all that. But those weren't the ones they showed me the movie about. It's old women. I bet you've been wondering why you haven't seen too many of those around anymore. And handmaids who've screwed up their 3 chances. And incorrigibles like me. Discards, all of us. They're sterile, of course. If they aren't that way to begin with, they are after they've been there for a while. When they're unsure, they do a little operation on you, so there won't be any mistakes. I'd say it's about 1/4 men in the colonies, too. Not all of those gender traitors end up on the wall. All of them wear long dresses, like the ones at the center, only gray. Women and the men, too, judging from the group shots. I guess it's supposed to demoralize the men, having to wear a dress. Shit, it would demoralize me enough. How do you stand it? Everything considered, I like this outfit better. So after that, they said I was too dangerous to be allowed the privilege of returning to the Red Center. They said I would be a corrupting influence. I had my choice, they said. This or the colonies. Well, shit, nobody but a nun would pick the colonies. I mean, I'm not a martyr. If I'd had my tubes tied, I wouldn't even have needed the operation. Nobody in here with viable ovaries either. You can see what kind of problems it would cause. So, here I am. They even give you face cream. You should figure out some way of getting in here. You'd have 3 or 4 good years before your snatch wears out and they send you to the boneyard. The food's not bad, and there's drink and drugs if you want it, and we only work nights. Moira, I say. You don't mean that. She is frightening me now, because what I hear in her voice is indifference, a lack of volition. Have they really done it to her then? Taken away something? What? That used to be so central to her? But how can I expect her to go on, with my idea of her courage, live it through, act it out, when I myself do not. I don't want her to be like me. Give in, go along, save her skin. That is what it comes down to. I want gallantry from her, swashbuckling, heroism, single-handed combat. Something I lack. Don't worry about me, she says. She must know some of what I'm thinking. I'm still here. You can see it's me. Anyway, look at it this way. It's not so bad. There's lots of women around. Butch paradise, you might call it. Now she's teasing, showing some energy. And I feel better. Do they let you? I say. Let? Hell, they encourage it. Know what they call this place among themselves? Jezebels. The ants figure we're all damned anyway. They've given up on us. So it doesn't matter what sort of vice we get up to. And the commanders don't give a piss what we do in our off time. Anyway, women on women sort of turns them on. What about the others? I say. Put it this way, she says. They're not too fond of men. She shrugs again. It might be resignation. Here's what I'd like to tell. I'd like to tell a story about how Moira escaped. For good this time. Or if I couldn't tell that, I'd like to say she blew up Jezebel's with 50 commanders inside it. I'd like her to end with something daring and spectacular. Some outrage. Something that would befit her. But as far as I know, that didn't happen. I don't know how she ended, or even if she did, because I never saw her again. They would have meant the aftermath of love. I saw your mother, Moira said. Where? I said. I felt jolted, thrown off. I realized I'd been thinking of her as dead. Not in person. It was in that film they showed us about the colonies. There was a close-up. It was her, all right. She was wrapped up in one of those gray things, but I know it was her. Thank God, I said. Why thank God? Said Moira. I thought she was dead. She might as well be, said Moira. You should wish it for her. I can't remember the last time I saw her. It blends in with all the others. It was some trivial occasion. She must have dropped by. She did that. She breezed in and out of my house, as if I were the mother and she were the child. She still had that jauntiness. Sometimes when she was between apartments, just moving into one or just moving out, she'd use my washer-dryer for her laundry. Maybe she'd come over to borrow something from me. A pot, a hairdryer. That too was a habit of hers. I didn't know it would be the last time, or else I would have remembered it better. I can't even remember what we said. A week later, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, when things had become suddenly so much worse, I tried to call her, but there was no answer, and no answer when I tried again. She hadn't told me she was going anywhere, but then maybe she wouldn't have. She didn't always. She had her own car, and she wasn't too old to drive. Finally, I got the apartment superintendent on the phone. He said he hadn't seen her lately. I was worried. I thought maybe she'd had a heart attack or a stroke. It wasn't out of the question, though she hadn't been sick that I knew of. She was always so healthy. She still worked out at Nautilus and went swimming every 2 weeks. I used to tell my friends she was healthier than I was. And maybe it was true. Luke and I drove across into the city, and Luke bullied the superintendent into opening up the apartment. She could be dead on the floor, Luke said. The longer you leave it, the worse it'll be. You thought of the smell? The superintendent said something about needing a permit, but Luke could be persuasive. He made it clear we weren't going to wait or go away. I started to cry. Maybe that was what finally did it. When the man got the door open, what we found was chaos. There was furniture overturned. The mattress was ripped open. Bureau drawers upside down on the floor, their contents strewn and mounded. But my mother wasn't there. "I'm going to call the police," I said. I'd stopped crying. I felt cold from head to foot. My teeth were chattering. "Don't," said Luke. "Why not?" I said. I was glaring at him. I was angry now. He stood there in the wreck of the living room, just looking at me. He put his hands into his pockets, one of those aimless gestures people make when they don't know what else to do. "Just don't," is what he said. "Your mother's neat," Moira would say, when we were at college. Later, "She's got pizzazz." Later still, "She's cute." "She's not cute," I would say. "She's my mother." "Gee," said Moira, "you ought to see mine." I think of my mother, sweeping up deadly toxins, the way they used to use up old women in Russia, sweeping dirt. Only this dirt will kill her. I can't quite believe it. Surely her cockiness, her optimism and energy, her pizzazz, will get her out of this. She will think of something. But I know this isn't true. It is just passing the buck, as children do, to mothers. I've mourned for her already. But I will do it again. And again.